Imagine like spending weeks building this massive, highly detailed behavior intervention plan.
Oh, man.
Right. And then you realize the data you based it all on was essentially lying to you.
That is the absolute worst.
It really is. I mean, you've trained the staff, you've completely rearranged the environment, you've overhauled the client's entire daily schedule.
And the target behavior just doesn't even budge.
Exactly. It doesn't budge. Today, we're looking at that ultimate diagnostic blind spot. We're getting into what happens when we rely on, subjective storytelling instead of objective reality.
It is a phenomenal way to frame the problem, honestly. Assuming human memory is just like a video recording that we can rewind and play back, that is a total recipe for clinical failure.
Yeah, totally.
Because we're dealing with a landscape of human behavior that is just notoriously unreliable if you only rely on what people say happened, or even worse, what they think they remember happening.
Right, which brings us to our focus today. Welcome to another custom-tailored deep dive designed specifically for you. Today, our mission is to completely unpack BCBA Foundation's task list item F.5.
Designing and evaluating descriptive assessments.
That's the one. And we've got a really formidable stack of sources today. We're pulling from mock exams, study guides, and some heavy-hitting clinical manuals, all focused on applied behavior analysis.
It's some great material.
It really is. The goal is to figure out how to observe behavior out there in the wild.
In the natural environments, yeah.
Exactly, without letting our own biases or anyone else's trick us.
Which is so hard to do. Shifting from those indirect retrospective accounts to actual real-time direct measurement, that's the core of this entire task list item.
And actually, this specific deep dive is inspired by the clinical systems over at Amethyst Therapy Services, Inc. You can find them at www.amethysttherapyservices.com.
They do some amazing work with data systems.
They really do. What they focus on is building strong, audit-proof observational systems that actually support incredibly accurate hypothesis development and treatment design.
Because if you want to be clinically elite, which is really what Amethyst is all about, you have to know how to capture data that actually means something.
Right.
The intervention systems you build are fundamentally limited by the integrity of the data you collect on the front end. If your data is garbage, your intervention is
garbage. Yeah, exactly. But before we get into the actual nuts and bolts of that data collection, I have to drop a quick teaser for you.
Oh, the trap.
Yes. Later on, we are going to cover what we call the exam trap. It's this massive pitfall where confusing a descriptive assessment with a functional analysis will absolutely cost you points on the board exam.
And much more importantly, it'll cost you in the clinic when you're actually trying to help a client.
Totally.
That is a trap that trips up countless practitioners, mostly because people just mistake correlation for causation.
Right. Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start with the operational baseline, the detective in the wild.
I love that analogy.
Thanks. Because, we know indirect assessments like reading scales, interviews, they rely on potentially flawed recall.
Yeah, someone fills out a form based on what they think triggered a meltdown, like last Tuesday.
Exactly. It's like asking witnesses what happened at a crime scene days later. But descriptive assessments, they demand actual real-time observation of the client in their everyday life. It's like hiding in the bushes with binoculars, watching the suspect in their natural habitat.
Well, hopefully slightly less creepy than that, but yes.
Fair. But it's not just passively watching either. I was reading through the clinical manuals, and honestly, doing a proper descriptive assessment feels like being a meteorologist tracking a massive storm system.
Ooh, I like that framing. How so?
Well, a meteorologist doesn't just look at the window and say, yep, it's raining.
Right, they look at the whole system.
Exactly. They're mapping the barometric pressure drops, they're tracking the wind direction, they log the humidity levels hours before the first drop of rain even falls.
And they keep tracking it after the storm passes, too.
Exactly. They can't necessarily see the storm forming with the naked eye, but they are systematically mapping the environmental conditions that predict it. And that's what we do. You directly observe the environment, the antecedent triggers, the behavior itself, and the consequences in real time.
What's fascinating here is that the purpose of mapping those environmental conditions isn't actually to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt why the behavior is happening.
Wait, really? Because I feel like that's what everyone thinks it is?
I know, but it's not. The goal of a descriptive assessment is just to gather solid baseline data and form a working hypothesis. You are looking for patterns.
Okay, that makes sense.
You're just identifying correlations between the environment and the behavior as it naturally occurs. You aren't proving the function yet.
Okay, so let's talk about the reality of that. Because if natural environments are that chaotic, like, say, a classroom with 30 kids or a busy household with siblings and pets running around,
Well, it's a lot to track.
it's massive. Just standing there with a blank notepad is a total recipe for disaster. You need a filter. How do we actually record what we're seeing in the bushes without getting completely overwhelmed?
Well, you need a highly structured system. And we all know ABC data inside out. But looking back at the foundational sources like the 1968 paper by Bijou, Peterson, and Alt,
Oh, the classic one.
yeah, there is a massive operational difference between how we intuitively think we should take ABC data and how we actually must do it to avoid bias.
And that difference is the divide between continuous and narrative recording, right?
Exactly. ABC continuous recording versus ABC narrative recording.
Mm-hmm.
And the research heavily favors the continuous method.
Let's dive deep into continuous recording first, because the sources reference a landmark 1993 study by Labouille and colleagues that really, I think, crystallizes how this works mechanically.
The Lawley study is brilliant.
Right. They didn't just ask observers to write down a story about what happened in a classroom. They essentially operationalized the entire environment into specific codes.
Yeah, the genius of Lawley et al. Was creating a system that tracked data without interrupting the natural flow of the observation. So, ABC continuous recording involves observing a client for a set, predetermined period of time.
Like a 20-minute block or something.
Exactly. But instead of writing a novel, observers use a pre-established data sheet with predefined specific environmental events and behaviors.
So during that 20-minute block, the observer isn't writing like, Johnny got mad when the teacher walked away.
No, not at all.
They're looking at their sheet at set intervals and just checking boxes, like antecedents such as one-on-one instruction or independent work.
Right. And then they check if the target behavior occurred. Then they check the consequences that followed, like attention provided or escape from task allowed.
And here is the really crucial part from what I read. They are recording these environmental events whether the problem behavior happens or not.
Yes. Catching the absence of the behavior is the entire point. That is what establishes the baseline rate of the environment.
Which brings us to the alternative method, right? ABC narrative recording.
The infamous narrative recording.
Yeah. In narrative recording, the observer only takes notes when the target behavior actually occurs. The pen basically doesn't move until the client engages in the behavior.
Right.
Now, I have to push back here a little bit, because if narrative recording means I am just writing down what happens when the behavior actually happens, isn't that way easier?
It feels easier, sure.
I mean, for a busy clinic or a school, it seems infinitely more efficient. You aren't constantly checking boxes every 30 seconds. Why wouldn't we just always do that?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we uncover the fatal flaw of narrative recording, which is exactly why the research flags its usefulness as highly questionable.
Okay, tell me why.
Narrative recording is basically a machine for generating false positives.
False positives.
Yes, because it completely lacks a comparative baseline.
Walk me through the mechanics of that false positive. Like, what does that actually look like in a classroom?
Okay, let's say a student is frequently shouting out in class. You're doing narrative recording. The student shouts, and you write down the consequence. The teacher walks over and issues a verbal reprimand.
Okay, pretty standard.
Right. And the next day, he shouts out again. Teacher reprimands him again. After a week of narrative data, you look at your sheet, and 100% of the time the student shouted, the teacher provided attention.
So the natural conclusion is that the behavior is maintained by attention.
Right, because that's literally all your data shows. But the blind spot is that you missed the 50 other times that day when the teacher gave the student attention while they were sitting completely quietly working on math.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
You missed the fact that the teacher was constantly hovering and providing attention throughout the entire observation period.
Because you only picked up your pen when the kids shouted.
Exactly. Without continuous recording, you are totally blind to the environmental conditions during the absence of the behavior. If attention is freely and constantly available in that environment, it's highly unlikely to be the specific reinforcer driving the problem behavior.
Man, it's like assuming umbrellas cause rain because every time you see an umbrella open, it's raining.
That is a perfect analogy.
But you're completely ignoring the baseline data of all the times people have their umbrellas closed when it's sunny. Narrative recording tricks you into confirmation bias because you only look for the trigger when the event is already happening.
Spot on. Continuous recording captures those baseline environmental rates, preventing you from confusing a constant feature of the environment with a unique consequence of the behavior.
Okay, so continuous ABC recording is our gold standard for descriptive data. I get that. But let's look at the reality of the field.
Yeah, it's tough out there.
BCBAs and RBTs are incredibly busy. You cannot observe a client continuously checking boxes every 30 seconds for a full 24-hour period. It's impossible.
It is entirely impossible. Time is the most finite clinical resource we have, which is why the scatter plot is such an elegant tool. It solves that exact problem of temporal distribution.
So how do you know when to do your ABC recording? I was looking at the scatter plot examples in the clinical manuals, and honestly, it just looks like a massive game of Battleship.
It really does look like a grid, yeah.
You've got the time of day listed down the y-axis, broken into 30-minute blocks. Across the x-axis, you have the days of the week, and the observer is just dropping an X in the corresponding grid box every time the target behavior occurs.
Yep, just marking the time.
But it feels like we're missing the why of the behavior entirely with this.
We are missing the why, but we are capturing the when. A scatter plot doesn't provide antecedents or consequences. Its value is purely temporal.
There's actually a great anecdote in the sources that illustrates this perfectly. A parent reports that their child is constantly running around the house, screaming and climbing on the furniture.
A very common scenario.
Right. So the behavior analyst could try to sit in the living room all day long taking ABC continuous data, which is highly intrusive and just a massive drain on resources.
And exhausting for everyone involved.
Exactly. But instead, they give the parent that Battleship grid.
They ask the parent to simply mark an X for every minute the behavior happens, completely ignoring the triggers and consequences for now. Just mark the time.
Exactly. And when the analyst gets the grid back after a week, the visual data reveals it isn't random chaos at all. There is a massive concentrated cluster of X's right before lunch and another huge cluster right before nap time.
And the rest of the grid is probably relatively blank.
Yeah, completely empty. The scatter plot didn't say if the behavior was for attention or escape or access to tangibles. It just said, grab your continuous ABC data sheets and be in the living room at 11:30 a.m. and 1:30 p.m.
And by narrowing the observation window, the clinician guarantees they're actually going to capture the behavior when they deploy their ABC continuous recording.
It saves so much time.
Massive amounts of time.
Yeah.
This is the definition of an audit-proof system, which ties back to the principles Amethyst Therapy Services advocates. You aren't just guessing when to observe. You have hard temporal data justifying your assessment schedule.
It protects clinical time and ensures the data you do collect is dense and relevant.
Exactly.
All right, so let's say we've used our scatter plot to pinpoint our observation window. We've used continuous ABC recording to map the environment and avoid those false positives.
Okay, we have our data.
We've got our data, and it clearly shows that 90% of the time, when our client engages in self-injury, a staff member runs over and tries to verbally soothe them. Attention follows the behavior. We have found the function. Let's write the treatment plan.
And that is the exact moment practitioners fall into the trap.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This is the exam trap we promised earlier, and it represents a fundamental misunderstanding of behavioral assessment.
The trap is treating a descriptive assessment as if it were a functional analysis. They serve entirely different scientific purposes.
Break that down for us, because they sound so similar to a lot of people.
Descriptive assessments, so our ABC data and our scatter plots, they only show correlations. They map what events tend to co-occur in time and space within the natural environment.
They tell you that A often happens before B and C often happens after.
Right. But correlation does not prove causation. Just because a staff member runs over to soothe the client after self-injury does not scientifically prove that the client is engaging in self-injury in order to get that attention.
It's just a coincidence, potentially.
Exactly. To prove causation, you must move beyond observation and conduct a functional analysis, or FA. An FA involves active, experimental manipulation of the environment.
So you're no longer mapping the weather. You are in a lab turning the wind and rain on and off to isolate the independent variable.
That's a great way to put it, yes.
Let's break down the mechanics of that experimental manipulation, because it's brilliant. You're intentionally setting up specific microenvironments to test your hypothesis.
Yes, you are.
The sources detail 4 standard conditions typically used in an FA: demand, attention, alone, and a play or control condition. How does turning these variables on and off actually prove causation?
You test the triggers by isolating them. So if you hypothesize the behavior is maintained by social positive reinforcement like attention condition, you run an attention condition.
Okay, how does that work?
The therapist intentionally withholds attention. They might sit in the room reading a book or turning away, and they only provide attention contingent upon the target problem behavior occurring.
Oh, so you're testing if the behavior can successfully turn the attention on.
Precisely. And you do the same thing for escape. You run a demand condition where you place continuous, difficult academic demands on the client.
Like rapid-fire math problems or something.
Right. And you only remove the demand allowing escape if the problem behavior occurs.
And then what about the play condition?
The play condition is equally critical. It serves as the control. In this condition, the client has free access to highly preferred items, frequent non-contingent attention is provided, and absolutely no demands are placed.
It's basically an enriched environment where the client theoretically has zero reason to engage in problem behavior.
Exactly. So if the rates of behavior are super high in the demand condition but near zero in the play condition, you have successfully isolated the independent variable.
You've proven a functional causal relationship between the demand and the behavior.
Yes. Which brings us back to why relying solely on descriptive data is so incredibly dangerous.
Right, because if descriptive data gives us a 90% correlation, why do we even need the FA to prove it?
This is all about routine environmental responses, masking as maintaining variables. The text calls this the conditional probabilities trap.
Condition probabilities, right.
In a complex natural environment, certain consequences happen frequently just as a matter of routine, totally unrelated to the true function of a behavior.
Give me an example of that. How does that trick the data?
Consider a student who frequently acts out by throwing items in a classroom. Teachers, by necessity, must maintain order, right?
Right, they can't just let kids throw things.
Exactly. So almost every single time this student throws an item, the routine environmental response is a verbal reprimand from the teacher. Stop doing that, or sit down.
So the probability of a reprimand occurring, given the behavior, is incredibly high. A descriptive ABC assessment is going to flag a massive correlation there. Behavior happens, reprimand follows.
The descriptive data absolutely screams attention function.
But then what happens if you run an FA?
Well, when you take that student and run a functional analysis, you put them in a lone condition. There's no teacher, no peers, no one to provide any form of social reinforcement.
Just the kid in a room.
Right. And guess what? The throwing behavior still occurs at incredibly high rates.
Wow. So the FA proves the behavior had nothing to do with the teacher's reprimands at all?
Nothing at all. The behavior is actually maintained by automatic or sensory reinforcement. The physical sensation of throwing simply feels good to the student.
That's wild. So the teacher's reprimands in the natural environment were just coincidental background noise.
Yes. The teacher was reacting to the behavior, but the behavior wasn't driven by the teacher's reaction.
And if you built an intervention based solely on that descriptive data, you'd write a plan focused entirely on withholding teacher attention.
And that plan would fail completely because you missed the sensory function.
Descriptive data captures the natural reactions of the environment, which are often just predictable human responses to challenging behavior. You absolutely need your descriptive data to form a rock-solid, data-driven hypothesis, but you cannot treat it as the forensic proof.
That's the perfect summary. Descriptive assessment provides the circumstantial evidence. The functional analysis provides the forensic, experimental proof.
So what does this all mean? Let's bring all these concepts together for you. If you are preparing for the exam or auditing your clinic systems, here are the core takeaways.
Let's hear them.
Descriptive assessments are your foundational tools for mapping the natural environment. When you deploy them, ABC continuous recording is vastly superior to narrative recording because it captures the baseline environment and prevents false positives.
And because continuous recording is super resource intensive, utilize scatter plots to identify temporal patterns. They provide the logic for your observation schedule, ensuring you are collecting dense data efficiently.
Finally, guard yourself against the exam trap. Descriptive data maps correlation. It does not prove causation. Do not build an intervention assuming a correlation is a functional relationship until you have verified it through the experimental manipulation of a functional analysis.
Could not have said it better.
And hey, if you want to dive deeper into building these kinds of unshakable, clinically elite systems, you really need to check out Amethyst Therapy Services, Inc.
They're a fantastic resource.
Whether you need advanced ABA content or BCBA and RBT exam prep that actually cuts through the noise, head over to www.amethysttherapyservices.com. Or you can shoot them an email at info@amethysttherapyservices.com. They are dedicated to helping practitioners build observation and assessment systems that are truly audit-proof.
because elevating the standard of measurement is how we elevate the standard of care across the entire field.
Absolutely. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, there is one last concept from the sources that we need to acknowledge.
A little food for thought.
Right. We've spent this entire time dissecting how to create perfect, objective observation systems to capture every single interaction between the client and their external environment.
But as we touched on with the alone condition in an FA, the sources repeatedly mention behaviors maintained by automatic or sensory functions. This directly references what B.F. Skinner called covert behavior, or private events.
We are talking about things happening inside the skin. We build these rigorous, technologically advanced systems to measure the observable world. But what if the truest function of a severe behavior isn't external at all?
This raises a profound question. What if the antecedent is an internal physiological pain we can't see, and the consequence is a private, hidden, sensory relief?
If the ultimate driver of a behavior is completely invisible to our continuous data sheets and our scatter plots, it forces us to ask, how much of a client's internal reality are we fundamentally missing, even with the most perfect observational system in the world? Something to think about as you design your next assessment.